In the last hours of the Third Reich, the center of German power was not in a palace nor in an advanced headquarters. It was underground, in a bunker saturated with final orders, unremoved bodies, and abandoned documents. There, the last decisions were made, the last decrees were signed, and the last suicides of the regime were executed. When the Soviet forces entered the Chancellery, they found a complex intact in its structure, but devastated inside. Maps updated by hand, rooms filled with personal belongings, destroyed communication equipment, and burnt human remains in the garden. Each room displayed a different collapse: the military, the administrative, and the psychological. What did those objects really reveal about the last days of the regime? What information was hidden among destroyed documents and incomplete remains? The last refuge: why the Führerbunker became the center of the Reich. The underground complex buried beneath the gardens of the Reich Chancellery was not intended to become the final seat of Nazi power. Initially conceived as a temporary refuge against bombings, the Führerbunker ended up transforming into the stage where the last act of a regime that promised to last 1,000 years was played out. This transformation was not the result of a planned decision, but the result of a concatenation of military defeats, personal decisions, and circumstances that turned a defensive space into the point from which they attempted to direct what was left of a disintegrating state. The complex had been born years earlier, when the Allied bombings on Berlin still did not threaten the continuity of the government. In 1936, during the monumental remodeling of the Chancellery designed by Albert Speer, the first defensive component was built, the Führerbunker, a relatively simple structure located under the previous wing of the government building. Its concrete walls, between 1 and 2 meters thick, offered adequate protection against conventional bombs, but the exponential increase in the intensity of Allied air attacks since 1943 forced the regime to consider more robust expansions. Between 1943 and 1944, the actual Führerbunker was excavated, located at greater depth, and designed to withstand direct impacts from heavy artillery. This expansion responded to an undeniable military reality. Berlin was no longer a safe city, and the Nazi leadership needed to guarantee its physical survival against an ever closer enemy. During most of the war, Hitler had directed operations from various headquarters scattered throughout the occupied territories. The Wolfschanze in East Prussia had been his main base since 1941, surrounded by dense forests and protected by concentric defensive systems. From there he oversaw operations on the Eastern Front. However, the Soviet offensive of January of 1945 on the Vistula forced the evacuation of that forest refuge. On the 16th of January, Hitler left the Wolfschanze for good and moved to Berlin. This decision marked the beginning of the process that would turn the bunker into the last operational center of the Reich. Initially, Hitler maintained his residence and offices on the upper levels of the Chancellery, using the bunker only during the most intense bombings. But the Soviet advance accelerated week by week. In February of 1945, the forces of the Red Army crossed the Oder, positioning themselves less than 80 kilometers from Berlin. By March, the bombings over the German capital had become so frequent and destructive that working on the surface became an activity constantly interrupted by air raid alarms and explosions. Military meetings began to be systematically held in the underground rooms, where the concrete protection allowed for some operational continuity. Hitler's decision to remain in Berlin during the final siege was rejected by multiple officers and close collaborators. Several members of the High Command proposed evacuating the government to the south, establishing a new base in the Bavarian Alps, and continuing resistance from a more defensible position. These proposals had solid tactical grounds. Berlin was surrounded, its supply lines destroyed, and its defense depended on fragmented units without effective coordination. However, Hitler dismissed these suggestions, arguing that abandoning the capital would amount to admitting defeat to the German people and to the soldiers themselves. For him, staying in Berlin had a symbolic value that exceeded any strategic consideration. This stance did not solely respond to political calculations. Hitler's behavior during the first months of 1945 reflected a progressive psychological isolation that turned the bunker into both a physical and emotional refuge. The military collapse of the Eastern Front, the loss of territories conquered with enormous effort, and the growing impossibility of reversing the situation generated an increasing disconnection between the orders issued from the bunker and the reality of the battlefield. Hitler continued to order counter-offensives with divisions that no longer existed, relied on reinforcements that would never arrive, and rejected reports that contradicted his perception of the conflict. The bunker, with its thick walls and artificial lighting, facilitated this isolation by creating a space where the outside destruction was partially absorbed. The Soviet encirclement of Berlin was consolidated between the 16th and the 25th of April. The forces of the First Byelorussian Front, commanded by Marshal Georgy Zhukov, penetrated the eastern defences of the city, while the First Ukrainian Front of Ivan Konev advanced from the south. The German defensive lines were collapsing almost as soon as they were established. The improvised units, composed of exhausted soldiers, wounded veterans, volunteers from the Hitler Youth, and Volkssturm personnel without adequate training, barely offered organized resistance. Under these conditions, the bunker stopped being an optional refuge to become the only space from which it was possible to coordinate some type of military activity, however limited it might have been. The concentration of Nazi leadership in the underground complex intensified rapidly. As the Soviets advanced through the peripheral neighborhoods of Berlin, more figures from the regime moved to the bunker seeking protection or instructions. The complex, designed to house a small number of people for brief periods, began to fill with military personnel. Personal assistants, secretaries, doctors, communication operators, SS escort members, and occasional visitors. This saturation transformed the internal environment. The narrow corridors became congested, rooms were shared, resources were rationed, and the atmosphere was charged with accumulated tension. The bunker then assumed functions that far exceeded its original purpose. It became headquarters, private residence, conference room, communications center, and improvised shelter. Military situation meetings were held in the small map room, where Hitler received increasingly fragmented reports on the state of the front. Communications with the outside were managed from a room equipped with radio transmitters and telephone lines that worked intermittently due to the damage caused by Soviet artillery. Administrative decisions, however symbolic they were drafted in damp and poorly lit offices. The daily life of the occupants took place in narrow rooms, with insufficient ventilation and no access to natural light. The role of the bunker as the center of the dying Reich was consolidated because it was the last space from which any semblance of unified authority could be exercised. Even when this authority became completely illusory, the place continued to be treated as the seat of power. From there, the final orders of the regime were issued, the failed attempt to coordinate the defense of Berlin by dividing the scarce resources between indefensible sectors, the order to maintain resistance to the last man in already lost positions, and the desperate attempt to organize an offensive by Army Group Steiner that Hitler conceived as a decisive blow, but that never materialized because the mentioned forces did not exist or were dispersed without operational capacity. These decisions, increasingly disconnected from military reality, were possible because the physical isolation of the bunker favored a fragmented perception of the battlefield. The reports that arrived were incomplete, contradictory, or deliberately manipulated by officers who feared provoking Hitler's wrath. Radio communications frequently failed. Telephone lines were cut. Messengers took hours to travel through destroyed streets or did not return. In this context, the bunker functioned as a closed chamber where information was distorted as it passed through multiple filters before reaching the decision-maker. The Soviet advance toward the center of Berlin progressively transformed the bunker into an island surrounded by destruction. As communications with the outside deteriorated, the complex became one of the few places in the city from which it was still possible to try to coordinate some military activity although its effectiveness decreased day by day. Basic systems operated through constant repairs and improvised adjustments. Each interruption of the power supply required resorting to internal generators that produced constant noise and excessive heat. Each water supply cut forced rationing consumption. The accumulation of people in such a small space created hygiene problems, overwhelmed the sanitary facilities, and filled the atmosphere with persistent odors. The continuous presence of Hitler inside the bunker also transformed it into a ceremonial center of declining power. Although the regime had lost practically all real operational capacity, the bunker continued to function as a symbolic headquarters where military appointments were reorganized, meaningless promotions were granted, and documents were signed that aimed to preserve the administrative continuity of the state. On April 29th, Hitler drafted and signed his political testament in one of the rooms of the bunker, establishing a line of succession that could no longer be implemented. This late administrative activity illustrates how the place had assumed a function that exceeded its technical purpose. It had become the stage from which the ideological continuity of Nazism was intended to be preserved through documents without any practical effect. The complete encirclement of the Chancellery area intensified the bunker's role as the regime's last enclave. Exits to the surface became dangerous or outright unfeasible. Nearby explosions caused constant vibrations that traveled through the concrete walls and affected the physical state of the occupants. Supplies became scarce and had to be managed with extreme care. In these conditions, the bunker ceased to be simply a refuge to become an autonomous microcosm, where daily life was distorted by the lack of natural light, limited ventilation, and the absence of regular contact with the outside. The Führerbunker became the center of the dying Reich due to the confluence of multiple factors: its physical resistance, superior to any other building in Berlin, Hitler's insistence on remaining in the capital despite all contrary recommendations, the progressive transfer of the administrative and military apparatus inside the complex, the intensification of the Soviet encirclement that made it impossible to operate from the surface, and the symbolic transformation of the place into the stage for the end of the Nazi leadership. Thus, a structure initially conceived as a supplementary refuge ended up housing the regime's last administrative gestures, the last acts of command, the last official documents, and the last moments of life of its main figures. Despite its reduced size and limited design, the Führerbunker absorbed the political and military functions of the Third Reich during its last weeks, becoming the final point from which an attempt was made to sustain, in conditions of total collapse, a state already without functional territory or sufficient forces to prevent its definitive annihilation. Designed to withstand architecture, structure, and internal atmosphere of the Führerbunker. The Führerbunker represented one of the most fortified underground shelter systems built by the Nazi regime in Berlin. Its design responded to the need to protect the German leadership from the Allied bombings that, since 1943, had turned the capital into a priority target. The complete structure was divided into two main components: the Vorbunker, more superficial and built first, and the Führerbunker itself, located at greater depth and designed to withstand much more intense attacks. Both spaces were internally connected, forming a complex that combined military functionality with the inherent limitations of an improvised underground construction over an already built urban area. The Vorbunker was built in 1936 during the remodeling of the Reich Chancellery. It was located beneath the front wing of the building and originally included rooms intended for emergency meetings, storage areas, and shelter for administrative staff. Its concrete walls were between 1 and 2 meters thick, enough to withstand conventional bombings, but vulnerable to attacks with high-penetration bombs. The design was simple. A central corridor connected a series of rectangular rooms without complex technical compartmentalization. The ventilation depended on ducts connected to the surface, vulnerable to obstructions by debris. The construction of the Führerbunker was carried out between 1943 and 1944, when the Allied bombings over Berlin were reaching their peak. The new complex was situated approximately 8 or 9 meters below ground level, with an additional concrete thickness over the top slab that varied between 2.5 meters and 3.5 meters, depending on the area. This thickness allowed for withstanding direct impacts from large bombs, although it did not guarantee absolute resistance against repeated attacks with heavy artillery. The structural design incorporated internal concrete walls of more than 2 meters, in some cases reinforced with steel bars interspersed in a mesh form. The set was intended as a high-resistance shelter rather than as a prolonged operations base, although in practice it ended up being used for both functions. Access to the Führerbunker was primarily from the Vorbunker via a narrow staircase with a steep slope. This internal connection allowed the flow of people without the need to leave the shelters and expose themselves to the outside. In addition to this connection, there was a secondary exit leading to the Chancellery garden, protected by a small access building with reinforced doors. This exit was used for messenger movements, for logistical tasks, and in the final days, it was used to remove the bodies of Hitler and Eva Braun for cremation. The access was designed to allow quick evacuations, but also to be easily defensible, with steel doors and narrow chambers that prevented a rapid advance of possible intruders. The interior of the Führerbunker was organized into 2 main corridors, arranged at an angle, forming an irregular layout that provided some flexibility in the distribution of rooms. The structure had approximately 17 main rooms, although the exact number varies slightly according to sources due to internal divisions and late adaptations. Among the most notable rooms were Hitler's bedroom, his conference room, the map room, the main office, Eva Braun's room, the communications room, several rooms for secretaries and assistants, a basic infirmary, a food storage area, and an auxiliary generator. The lighting in the bunker was completely artificial. The absence of windows and the depth at which it was located prevented any entry of natural light. The low-power lamps dispersed a yellowish light that created an opaque and narrow atmosphere. The electric power was supplied through lines connected to the urban grid, but due to frequent interruptions from bombings, they often relied on internal generators. These generators produced constant noise and emitted heat, which increased the temperature in the closest hallways and rooms without adequate ventilation to dissipate it. The occupants had to get used to variations in brightness, brief blackouts, and the recurring feeling of confinement caused by the lack of light and sound isolation. The ventilation of the bunker was a crucial aspect of its operation. Air filtration systems connected to the surface through ducts, protected with reinforced grills, were used. The outside air first passed through filters designed to retain dust, smoke, and particles derived from bombings, although they were not prepared to withstand prolonged chemical attacks. The power of the ventilation system varied, and at times of high demand or power outages, the flow was reduced, leading to a noticeable accumulation of carbon dioxide and humidity. This saturated environment generated physiological effects like headaches, dizziness, and fatigue, exacerbated by the lack of natural light and the psychological pressure of the underground environment. The communication system of the bunker was composed of direct telephone lines to several key military positions, including the High Command of the Wehrmacht, the High Command of the Army, and some Berlin garrisons. However, these lines were vulnerable to damage caused by Soviet artillery. When the landlines were not working, internal radio systems operated from a specific room equipped with short and medium-range transmitters were used. The communications room had additional reinforced walls and its own ventilation system to prevent the overheating of the equipment. The staff worked exhaustive shifts and maintained constant reports on the stability of the lines, especially in the last days of April when most of the urban network was destroyed. In terms of sanitary infrastructure, the Führerbunker had bathrooms, a rudimentary drainage system, a small kitchen, and several potable water storage points. Water was initially pumped from the urban network, but when this stopped working, prior storage and rationing were used. The kitchen used electric stoves and was equipped to prepare simple foods, as the logistical provision was limited. The storage chambers mainly held preserves, black bread, sausages, canned goods, and low-quality coffee. Due to the overpopulation of the bunker in April of 1945, the sanitary facilities operated above capacity. The humidity and lack of air circulation produced persistent odors that accumulated in the corridors and rooms closest to the bathrooms. The acoustic design of the bunker contributed to a peculiar atmosphere. Although the concrete walls muffled the outside noise, the powerful explosions of bombs or artillery could be felt as deep vibrations, transmitted through the underground structures. Inside, however, the bare concrete favored the reverberation of voices, footsteps, and daily activities, creating a closed and sometimes amplified auditory effect. The narrow corridors produced brief echoes that heightened the sensation of confinement. The noise of generators, fans, and communication equipment was constant, so absolute silence was practically non-existent. The spatial distribution of the rooms was designed to create a functional hierarchy. Hitler's rooms and those of his closest circle were located in the most protected area, separated from the rest by additional doors and a secondary corridor. Hitler's bedroom was notably austere. It included a single bed, a sofa, a work table, and some shelves. The conference room was equipped with large maps, folding tables, and boards with military indicators. The proximity between these rooms allowed for quick meetings without covering long distances, which was essential in a context of constant attacks and urgent decisions. Eva Braun's room, located next to Hitler's, had a simpler layout, with basic furniture and minimal decoration. Her presence in the bunker meant adapting spaces that were originally not intended to serve as private rooms. Several secretaries shared small rooms with desks and narrow beds, while the high-ranking officers had slightly larger but equally Spartan quarters. The lower-ranking military personnel and guards were housed in the Führerbunker or in makeshift rooms in spaces originally intended for storage. The map room, one of the nerve centers of the complex, was equipped with cartographies of the Eastern Front, Western Front, and of the city of Berlin itself. The punctual lighting allowed for a clear view of the topographic details, although interruptions in the electric supply made its continuous use difficult. During the final days, several maps were kept updated through manual annotations, since new prints could not be obtained easily. As the military situation worsened, increasingly smaller maps were integrated, limited to the immediate area of Berlin, reflecting the constriction of the field of operations. From an architectural point of view, the Führerbunker featured a mixed design between military utility and concern for the personal safety of the Führer. The main doors were solid steel, some with airtight closing mechanisms to protect against dust and gases. The internal chambers were arranged so that the most vulnerable areas, such as communications and storage, were kept away from the most protected core. Additional measures were incorporated, such as double gates at certain access points and checkpoints where personnel circulation could be restricted. The internal environment was marked by constant humidity. Condensation formed on the cooler surfaces, especially in the less ventilated corridors and rooms. This humidity affected documents, clothes, and furniture, which required moving some documents to drier areas and keeping certain objects away from the walls. The characteristic smell of the bunker was a mixture of humidity, stored food, generator fuel, and prolonged human presence in a closed space. The available dehumidifiers were not enough to significantly improve the overall condition of the environment. Regarding structural resistance, the bunker was designed to withstand significant vertical and horizontal impacts. Tests conducted by German engineers during its construction confirmed that the walls could withstand nearby explosions, although a direct hit from a deep penetration weapon could compromise it. In practice, Soviet bombings and artillery shells caused minimal damage to the main structure, although some areas of the Führerbunker experienced intense vibrations and detachment of small concrete fragments. The Führerbunker was designed for temporary and rotating occupancy, not for a prolonged stay of tens of people under extreme conditions. However, military pressure forced it to be occupied continuously, which created logistical problems that the structure was not prepared to solve. As more personnel moved to the bunker, additional beds were set up, hallways were occupied with improvised items, and storage areas were adapted for temporary uses. This contributed to an increasingly dense and less functional environment during the last days. The existence of the bunker as an architectural structure responded to the attempt to create a space that would guarantee the continuity of Nazi command in case of devastating attacks. Although conceived to protect, it ended up being the physical setting of the regime's disintegration, not due to construction flaws, but due to the magnitude of the military defeat. Its reinforced design allowed command activities to continue days after the surface became impracticable, and its rooms became the final archive of decisions, documents, and movements of the last core of German power in Berlin. Confinement, routine, and disintegration. Life inside the bunker during the last days. Life inside the bunker during the last few weeks of April of 1945 was characterized by a combination of forced routine, progressive logistical deterioration, and collective psychological disintegration. What had been conceived as a temporary refuge transformed into an underground prison where dozens of people coexisted in overcrowded conditions, with limited resources and under the constant pressure of an imminent military defeat. The atmosphere of the bunker during these days reflected the collapse of the Nazi regime not only in political and military terms, but also in its most human and everyday dimension. The permanent occupation of the bunker did not occur suddenly. During January and February of 1945, Hitler continued using the Chancellery facilities on the surface, resorting to the underground shelter only during the heaviest bombings. However, from March onward, the frequency of air attacks and the Soviet advance toward Berlin forced virtually all important administrative and military activities to move inside the complex. From then on, the bunker ceased to be an emergency space to become the permanent center of operations and forced residence of its growing number of occupants. The core of permanent residents included Hitler, Eva Braun, Josef and Magda Goebbels with their 6 children, Martin Bormann, generals such as Wilhelm Burgdorf, Hans Krebs and Wilhelm Munke, as well as a group of secretaries, personal assistants, doctors, radio operators, SS guards and messengers. As the military situation worsened, some senior officers temporarily attended to participate in military leadership meetings, while others stayed permanently due to the impossibility of moving around the city. This concentration of functions and personnel far exceeded the foreseen capacity of the underground facilities. The daily routine inside the bunker was strongly determined by Hitler's irregular rhythm. His deteriorated health condition and disrupted sleep cycle defined the general temporality of the complex. Hitler usually got up after noon and, following a late breakfast, began the military conferences, which could last for several hours. These meetings were mainly held in the map room or in his small private conference room, where the generals presented reports on the situation at the front. As communications deteriorated, the reports became more fragmentary and depended on messengers or unstable telephone communications, which affected the precision of the information and increased the tension among those present. The military conferences were moments of continuous tension for the officers. Hitler demanded explanations for each defeat and pressed for counterattacks that had no real chance of success. The order to hold positions without the possibility of withdrawal dominated almost all discussions. The impossibility of fulfilling these orders generated severe discussions among those present, and many officers left the meetings with a sense of frustration or resignation. As the days passed, the atmosphere became increasingly rigid and hostile, as Hitler reacted with irritation to any negative information. The lack of regular breaks and the sensory isolation of the bunker exacerbated the tensions in a cumulative manner. Hitler's routine also influenced the rest of the staff. His meals were always served in the bunker dining room, where he exclusively had vegetarian dishes prepared under strict supervision. A limited menu was followed due to the shortage of supplies, and although priority was given to the Führer, the quality of food decreased as the Soviet encirclement intensified. The meals for the rest of the staff were simple: bread, canned goods, hard cheeses, and soups prepared with stored ingredients. The kitchen, small and poorly ventilated, operated almost non-stop to meet the demand of more than 50 people during the last days of April. Eva Braun maintained an independent routine from Hitler. She occupied her adjoining room, where she spent most of the time reading magazines, writing letters, arranging her clothes, or listening to music when possible. Although her presence had no impact on political or military decisions, it provided a marked contrast to the intense activity of the conference rooms. Her role within the bunker was mainly limited to Hitler's private companionship, but her stay became an everyday element of the underground environment. The lack of recreational activities and the prolonged confinement also affected her emotional state, though she tried to maintain an appearance of normality in increasingly abnormal circumstances. The secretaries, like Traudeljunge and Gerda Christian, worked in cramped and dark spaces, typing Hitler's dictations and drafting final versions of the numerous documents that were still issued despite the state of collapse. Their routine included hours of typing interrupted by power outages or improvised orders requiring constant rewrites. Tension increased especially towards the end of April, when Hitler's political will was drafted and multiple communications were intended for different figures of the regime. The secretaries slept in shared rooms, with single beds and little personal space. The constant noise of fans and generators made it difficult to rest adequately. Radio operators played an essential role in the last few weeks. Their room contained transmission and reception equipment that operated in very precarious conditions. The constant power outages, interference caused by the bombings, and the deterioration of urban infrastructure made message transmission difficult. The operators worked in shifts that extended beyond the stipulated hours due to the reduced available personnel and the vital importance of maintaining communication with the few defensive points still active. Alarms were often raised for temporary system failures, which necessitated improvised repairs made under pressure. The life of the guards and members of the SS escort was equally tense. They had to control the accesses and ensure internal security, but the main risk no longer came from inside, but from outside the complex. The continuous bombings caused vibrations to run through the walls of the bunker, and some sectors of the Führerbunker suffered minor detachments. The guards slept and rested in improvised rooms, often in stacked bunk beds or folding beds distributed in side corridors. The psychological burden of protecting a space that, in military terms, was doomed, severely affected morale. Several guards voluntarily requested to be sent to the surface for brief missions, indicating that some preferred to risk external combat rather than endure the constant underground pressure. Joseph Goebbels' group introduced an additional element of complexity into the life of the bunker. The presence of his 6 children, confined in adapted rooms in the Führerbunker, created a different dynamic due to the noise, occasional crying, basic feeding needs, and the difficulty of maintaining a suitable environment for children in a space designed exclusively for military and administrative personnel. Magda Goebbels had to supervise them while also assisting in tasks related to her husband, who operated as a main political figure in the last days of the regime. The children's presence highlighted the contradiction between the original purpose of the bunker and the use it was given at the end of the war. The physical conditions of the bunker directly influenced the routine. The lack of natural light altered sleep cycles, causing many to go to bed very late or not sleep more than a few consecutive hours. The stale air, humidity, and the permanent smell of stored or cooked food affected overall well-being. Showers were rare due to water shortage, and insufficient ventilation caused clothes to take a long time to dry when hand-washed. The water used in the kitchen and bathrooms had to be carefully rationed, especially towards the end of the siege, when urban supply systems were completely destroyed. The medical activity within the bunker was in charge of Dr. Ludwig Stumpfegger and Dr. Werner Haas, who had a small room that functioned as a rudimentary infirmary. Their work consisted mainly of attending to minor health problems stemming from tension, fatigue, and the enclosed environment, as well as treating slight injuries caused by hasty movements or small internal accidents. During the last days, they also had to prepare the cyanide doses intended for Hitler, Eva Braun, and other members of the inner circle. The doctors maintained a limited supply of medications, including painkillers, sedatives, and some substances for emergencies, although the availability was progressively decreasing. External communications, both to military commanders and to other regime offices outside Berlin, became a central element of the routine. Liaison officers had to move within the complex with updated reports. Frequently, contradictions arose between reports from different areas, leading to internal discussions about the truthfulness of the information. This uncertainty was exacerbated by the Soviet advance towards the center of the city. Each day, brief excursions outside were made to verify the situation, coordinate defensive movements, or attempt to establish contact with units that were reported as active but no longer existed. The logistical deterioration accelerated toward mid-April. The supplies remaining in the Chancellery could not be easily moved to the bunker due to the danger involved in crossing areas exposed to Soviet artillery. This forced the improvisation of solutions, such as rationing meals and reducing the number of lit lamps. The coffee was mixed with lower quality substitutes, and the bread was served in smaller portions. The temperature fluctuated according to the operation of the generators. Sometimes it was too hot due to continuous operation, and other times the cold intensified during blackouts. The psychological deterioration of those present manifested in altered behaviors and interpersonal dynamics. Many described an atmosphere marked by brief arguments, irritability, prolonged silences, and episodes of dejection. People slept less, talked less, and showed signs of prolonged exhaustion. Attendance at military meetings became tense, with some officers displaying obvious expressions of defeat. Secretaries and operators reported difficulties concentrating due to the constant noise and increasing pressure. Hitler experienced a visible physical deterioration during this period. He suffered from hand tremors, difficulties walking without support, and evident fatigue. His emotional conduct alternated between periods of intense anger and episodes of silent resignation. Meetings became increasingly shorter as Hitler lost energy. This deterioration directly affected the atmosphere in the bunker, as the staff relied on his orders to organize their own daily work. Suicide became a recurring topic in private conversations within the bunker towards the end of April. Several members of Hitler's entourage requested or received cyanide ampules. Discussions about the end were conducted quietly, especially among the secretaries and some officers. Hitler informed his closest staff of his intention to remain in Berlin and die there, which confirmed the impossibility of a general evacuation. This announcement had a direct effect on the morale of the staff, who understood that continued defense was militarily pointless. After Hitler's suicide on the 30th of April, the routine of the bunker was profoundly altered. Activities related to the incineration of the bodies, the drafting of final communications, and the redistribution of responsibilities were immediately organized. Joseph Goebbels assumed political command and ordered operations to be maintained from the bunker, although his command capacity was purely symbolic. The atmosphere became quieter, with reduced movements and brief conversations. Many people left the bunker to try to escape or surrender to the Soviet forces, while others remained to fulfill short-term orders or to accompany their superiors. Magda Goebbels' suicide and the death of her children on May 1st further deepened the internal deterioration. This event shocked even those who were already emotionally exhausted. The remaining staff understood that the command structure had completely collapsed. The last hours of the bunker were a period of confusion, with some seeking escape routes and others choosing to remain out of loyalty or resignation. On May 2nd, when the Soviet forces took over the sector and the rest of the Chancellery surrendered, the bunker ceased to function as an operational place. The rooms were in disarray, with scattered documents, uneaten food, unmade beds, and personal belongings abandoned in narrow, damp rooms. The Soviet incursion first look inside the bunker. The entry of Soviet forces into the area of the Reich Chancellery and subsequently into the Führerbunker complex was a direct result of the final advance of the offensive against Berlin, carried out mainly by the First Belarusian Front under the command of Georgy Zhukov, complemented by the First Ukrainian Front of Ivan Konev. During the last days of April and the first days of May 1945, Soviet troops consolidated the siege and specifically moved towards the government buildings that symbolized the center of Nazi power. The discovery and penetration of the bunker were part of a military operation that combined immediate tactical objectives with the political need to confirm the situation of Hitler and his close circle. On the 30th of April of 1945, while Hitler committed suicide in his study of the bunker, Soviet troops were already at a short distance from the Chancellery. The outer perimeter of the complex had been defended by elements of the Panzer Division Müncheberg, by remnants of the 20th SS Grenadiers Division, and by volunteers from the Hitler Youth. However, these forces were completely outnumbered and outgunned. The streets around the bunker were full of craters, rubble, and destroyed vehicles, making organized movement almost impossible. Soviet forces fought house to house and advanced through the tactic of gradual demolition, using heavy artillery against buildings that might harbor resistance. The Chancellery suffered direct impacts from artillery, propelled projectiles, and anti-tank grenades. The section covering the upper gardens, under which the bunker was located, was repeatedly struck. However, the underground structure did not suffer direct penetrations, partly due to the thickness of the concrete and partly to the irregular shape of the complex. The exterior access points were obstructed with debris, destroyed machinery, and remnants of military personnel who had attempted to defend the perimeter. The entrances through the main building were damaged, but not completely rendered useless. After the partial surrender of the sector's defenses on the 2nd of May, Soviet troops entered the remnants of the Chancellery. The scene they found was chaotic: collapsed walls, isolated fires, documents scattered on the floor, and bodies not removed. The interior of the building had turned into a mix of rubble and structural destruction. The Soviets advanced cautiously, aware of possible explosive traps and the presence of snipers. Although the German resistance had ceased in most of the area, systematic searches were carried out before proceeding to the underground areas. The exact location of the bunker access was not evident to the first units that entered the Chancellery. The underground complex was not externally marked, and some entrances had been partially destroyed. The identification of the accesses was possible thanks to the capture of German personnel who remained in the building, including low-ranking officers and domestic staff members who had not escaped. These individuals were immediately interrogated and provided the approximate location of the stairs connecting the Chancellery with the Führerbunker. The first Soviet entry into the Führerbunker occurred hours after the surrender of the sector. The description of the interior state reveals a dark space laden with humidity and disordered due to the abrupt movements of the personnel during the last days of the battle. The Soviets found beds, overturned tables, abandoned documents, scattered clothing, and remnants of food. The electric lamps were off due to the supply interruption. Some electric cables had been cut or destroyed by vibrations. Ventilation was minimal, and the smell was a combination of humidity, accumulated sweat, and food residues. The entrance to the Führerbunker, deeper, involved descending narrow stairs partially blocked by plaster debris and concrete fragments. The Soviets proceeded with extreme caution due to the possibility of explosives placed at strategic entrances. They found no booby traps, but they did find evidence that some areas had been prepared for partial destruction in case of capture. These preparations had not been activated, possibly due to the lack of trained personnel or the speed of the Soviet encirclement. Upon entering the lower level, the soldiers found the bunker in a state that reflected the last hours of occupation. The rooms were structurally intact, but with clear signs of recent use. In the room that had served as a military conference room, there were maps on the walls, some torn off and others with handwritten annotations. Several tables were covered with papers, empty glasses, and cigarette remnants. The Soviets noted that the humidity had affected several documents, with curled edges and condensation stains. The chairs were placed without order. Some pushed against the walls as if they had been used to improvise space amidst the military activity. Hitler's bedroom was quickly identified. In it, they found a single unmade bed, a worn-out sofa, a work table with scattered documents and pencils, and a fallen lamp. The disorder in the room was consistent with extensive use in the previous days. On the table, the Soviets found open boxes containing personal effects, some medications, several empty containers, and unsorted papers. There were no significant valuable objects. Many had been removed by the occupants before the suicides or during the escape attempts. In the adjoining room, where Eva Braun's bedroom was located, the situation was similar. There were clothes scattered about, personal items, perfumes, and toiletries on a small table. The Soviets noticed that some garments had been hastily folded, probably in an attempt to pack belongings, before the decision was made to remain in the bunker until the end. They also found cigars, a small damaged radio, and photographs on a dresser. No signs of prior looting were found, indicating that the personnel's departure happened too quickly to organize a complete evacuation of personal belongings. The communications room was one of the areas where the Soviets detected the highest level of technical disorder. The equipment was turned off, and some seemed to have been used until the last moment. There were headphones hanging, partially dismantled transmitters, and depleted batteries. Some cables were burned or broken, indicating electrical overload or damage from vibration during air raids. Notebooks with technical notes, frequency lists, and messages recorded during the last few days were found, many written hastily. There were also food remnants and cups, indicating that the staff worked in extended shifts without leaving the room. The dining room of the bunker showed signs of recent use: unwashed dishes, trays with remnants of dry bread, and opened canned goods. The kitchen, equipped with an electric stove and a small sink, had uncleaned utensils and stored food remnants in cupboards. The Soviets found opened packages of coffee, sugar, and flour. On a shelf, there were empty bottles, some of them of cheap wine or mixed drinks, probably consumed during the last nights. The smell in this area was a mix of rancid food and accumulated humidity. The infirmary presented a tidy appearance compared to other parts of the bunker. There were folding stretchers, empty medicine bottles, and used bandages. On a table, basic medical instruments and remains of discarded material were found. The Soviets detected a residual smell of medicinal alcohol. On a side table, there were several ampules of cyanide, some open and others in their original packaging. The presence of these substances confirmed that suicide was planned and that materials had been provided for those who wished to use them. One of the most significant discoveries occurred in the outer garden, not inside the bunker, but directly related to the activities carried out inside it: the burnt remains of Hitler and Eva Braun. After their suicide, both were moved to the surface and burned in an improvised pit. The Soviets found the area partially covered with debris and displaced soil. Bone fragments, remains of burnt clothing, parts of a gun, and metal remnants that corresponded to buckles and partially melted personal items were found in the area. The identification of the bodies required further analyses carried out by specialized teams. Inside the bunker, in a small vestibule near the private rooms, the Soviets found traces of dried blood on the floor and on a wall, which matched the descriptions of the scene where Hitler and Eva Braun were prepared before being taken to the surface. These stains, along with footprints and drag marks, confirmed that the staff had acted quickly to carry out the instructions to cremate the bodies. In other areas of the bunker, especially in rooms intended for aides and secretaries, the Soviets found common personal objects: underwear, family photographs, notebooks, cigarettes, lipsticks, and incomplete letters. This evidence reflected that the abandonment of the bunker had been abrupt. On some desks, unclassified official documents, incomplete orders, or messages that were never sent were found. The Soviets collected them to be analyzed by the intelligence services. The presence of the Goebbels children and their death in the Führerbunker left an immediate trace for the Soviets. They found the beds where they had been sedated and subsequently poisoned, with wrinkled sheets, empty vials, and remnants of children's clothing. The scene evidenced that the act had been methodical and carried out a few hours before the Soviet entry. The exploration continued for several hours and required artificial lighting provided by flashlights and portable lamps, as the electrical system was not functioning. The temperature inside the complex was cold and the humidity high, which made the inspection more difficult. The Soviets moved objects and documents to the surface to classify them. They also interrogated any captured staff members on site to obtain confirmation about the layout of the rooms and the latest movements inside the bunker. The Soviets also recorded signs of hasty abandonment in the form of undestroyed documents. Unlike other government buildings where the Germans burned papers in boilers or improvised incinerators, in the bunker only small piles of burned papers were found, insufficient to suggest a systematic attempt to eliminate evidence. This may be due to the lack of adequate ventilation, the urgency of the moment, or the absence of sufficient fuel for a complete burn. During the inspection, it was revealed that several rooms of the bunker had been rendered unusable or blocked before the Soviet entry. Some interior doors were closed off with displaced furniture or with piled-up objects to prevent passage. These blockades seemed improvised and reflected defensive maneuvers carried out in the final hours before the surrender. The Soviets dismantled them to access the internal areas. The general state of the bunker, as found by the Soviets, was that of a space that had hosted intense activity until the last moment. The traces of recent use were evident in all the rooms: unmade beds, tables with various objects, scattered documents, plates with food remnants, empty bottles, technical equipment turned off, and signs of hurried movements of the personnel. No significant structural damages caused by direct combat were observed. The structure itself had withstood the bombings, but the internal infrastructure, cables, lighting, ventilation, was damaged or disabled. The Soviet entry into the bunker marked the beginning of a process of gathering evidence, verifying identities, and official documentation that was carried out under strict supervision of political commanders and NKVD agents. The first contact with the interior of the bunker offered the Soviet forces a material view of the last days of the Nazi regime, with visible evidence in every room reflecting the administrative, psychological, and operational collapse of its occupants. What was left behind? Objects, documents, and remains found in each room. The Soviet entry into the Führerbunker allowed for a detailed record of the objects, documents, and remains that had been left inside following the surrender of the Chancellery sector. The information comes from Soviet military reports, NKVD reports, photographs taken during the first days of inspection, and subsequent descriptions prepared by intelligence specialists. The result was a fragmentary but significant inventory that allows reconstruction of what elements remained in the complex and how they reflected its use during the final days of the Third Reich. The room-by-room review reveals both the administrative and military activity of the place and the daily habits of its occupants. The main access to the bunker showed from the very beginning a level of recent activity. In the lobby of the Führerbunker, there were found remains of civilian clothing, helmets, belts, small boxes with ammunition, and loose papers scattered by the movement of personnel. Some of these papers consisted of unsent telegraphic orders, incomplete defensive schemes, and notes from lower-ranking officials. In the corners were fabric bags with personal items, apparently abandoned by those who attempted to move to safer areas in the final moments. In the transition between the Führerbunker and the Führerbunker, the stairs held bags, canteens, empty bottles, and remnants of plaster that had fallen off during the bombings. Some opened cans of preserves and loose utensils suggested that even this area had been briefly used as a resting point or improvised feeding area during the final saturation of the complex. The Soviets collected these remnants as evidence of the density of occupancy in the final days. Upon entering the main hallway of the Führerbunker, they found depleted flashlights, loose electrical cables, typewritten texts, and small agendas. The hallway served as a constant transit point, so it contained items dragged from other rooms. Some walls had scuff marks from displaced furniture, indicating constant relocations to facilitate personnel movement. On a side table appeared cups with drinks already evaporated, cigarette butts, and empty matchboxes. The guard area, located near the main entrance, featured light weapons abandoned, mainly Walther pistols, 2 unloaded submachine guns, and small ammunition boxes. There were also helmets, vests, and documentation from SS guards, including shift lists reflecting the progressive reduction of personnel. On an improvised bed, the Soviets found a broken holster, food remnants, and a dirty blanket, evidence that the space had been used for sleeping in the last few days. The military conference room, one of the most important spaces of the complex, contained numerous maps on the walls, many of them covered with annotations in pencil or pen. Several maps of the Eastern Front showed manually drawn lines of combat that had moved too fast to be updated with printed material. The central table contained several compasses, rulers, pencils, and partial documents on movements of units that no longer existed. There were broken glasses, empty bottles, and plates, which confirmed that meetings were held while the staff ate due to the lack of formal breaks. A stack of papers tied with string included transfer orders, unprocessed military reports, and some final instructions dictated by Hitler in the last conferences. The chairs around the table were placed without order, indicating that the attendees had left hastily. In one corner, the Soviets found full ashtrays and dark stains on the floor derived from spilled coffee or drinks. The room showed a clear combination of intense work, organizational chaos, and hasty abandonment. In Hitler's personal office, the Soviets found open books, typewritten papers, several folders with notes, and a magnifying glass on the table. The main lamp had fallen, and one of the drawers had been partially emptied. Among the most notable objects were several boxes of medications, probably vitamins, painkillers, and stomach remedies regularly used by Hitler. A partially damaged copy of a biography of Frederick the Great was also found, along with several printed articles and documents on defensive movements. Some papers were crumpled or partially torn, possibly as a result of discussions or quick discards. In a trash can located under the desk, torn papers with notes about units on the Eastern Front appeared. The Soviets also found empty correspondence envelopes and worn-out pencils. The content reflected that Hitler, despite his physical deterioration, continued to modify and review documents until the end. On a nearby shelf were empty jars labeled as vitamin products and digestive remedies, consistent with those used by his personal doctor. Hitler's bedroom contained an unmade single bed with wrinkled sheets and a thick, dark-colored blanket. Next to the bed was a small table with an empty glass, a small container with pills, and a stopped table clock. The wardrobe, partially open, held several military jackets hung up neatly, but without the complete insignias, which had probably been removed for immediate use or were in other rooms. There were also well-aligned shoes, a clothes brush, and some folded garments. No personal valuables were found, indicating they had been removed earlier, or that Hitler did not keep jewelry or similar items in his bedroom. Eva Braun's bedroom contained clothes, toiletries, and personal items. On a table, there were cosmetics, a portable mirror, makeup, a half-full perfume bottle, and loose photographs. The clothes were distributed irregularly. Some dresses were hanging in the wardrobe, while several intimate garments were on a chair or folded on the bed. In a dresser, the Soviets found several letters written in the previous days, some unfinished. There were also small boxes with cigarettes, 2 lighters, and a pack of candies. The bed was partially made, indicating recent use. In a box under the bed were found several pairs of shoes and personal accessories like gloves, handkerchiefs, and scarves. On a shelf, there was a damaged portable radio, probably used by Braun to listen to music or entertainment programs before his suicide. The room had elements that showed an attempt to maintain a domestic routine in a space that was not designed for such a purpose. In the secretary's rooms, typewriters, typed papers, letters dictated by Hitler, and unfinished documents were found. One typewriter still had a sheet inserted with an incomplete sentence. There were cups with remnants of dry coffee, pencils, erasers, and reading glasses. Several beds were unmade, with clothes scattered. The bedside tables contained personal items such as combs, family photographs, and small mirrors. The secretaries had left brief notes, some dated the 29th and 30th of April. Several additional rooms intended for assistants and administrative staff showed a similar degree of disorder. The Soviets found military garments mixed with civilian clothes, boxes with documents, open suitcases, and food scraps. Some books were scattered on the floor, along with magazines and notebooks. The simultaneous presence of work objects and personal belongings reflected the improvised nature of the final occupation of the bunker. The communications room contained partially dismantled technical equipment. The Soviets found transmitters, receivers, headphones, and repair tools. There were papers with handwritten frequencies and recorded messages, some of them with the last transmission time before the complete collapse of the urban network. The surfaces were covered with dust and remnants of burnt cables. The shelves had depleted batteries and tools. On a table, there were empty cups, leftover bread, and several cigarette butts, a sign that the operators worked until the end. The kitchen contained frying pans, pots, dirty dishes, and trays. On the shelves were some unopened canned goods, partially used jars of jam, and open cans. There was a strong smell coming from decomposing food. The Soviets found bags with flour, hardened sugar, stale bread, and packets of coffee. A cutting board had recent remnants of bread and cold cuts. The kitchen clearly showed that the staff had used it until the final moments. The dining room contained tables with unwashed dishes and remnants of recent meals. The floor was covered with pieces of bread, papers, and wrappers. Some chairs had been moved roughly. On one table were empty bottles, glasses, and full ashtrays. It was evident that the staff had eaten there while continuing with military activities. The infirmary contained folding stretchers, empty medicine bottles, used gauzes, syringes, and small first aid boxes. On a table were remains of cyanide ampules, some of them opened. Medical instruments such as scissors, tweezers, and disinfectant bottles were also found. Partial medical documents showed notes on the health status of some occupants. In a drawer were new bandages and envelopes of painkillers. The presence of cyanide ampules confirmed the distribution of poisons before the suicides. The collection of objects found in the bunker provided physical evidence of the final life of the regime. Unsent papers, hand-updated maps, abandoned personal items, light weapons, food remnants, and clear signs of suicides and administrative disintegration. The bunker was presented as a saturated space used to the limit and urgently abandoned in the face of the total collapse of the German military system. The problem of human remains: identification, handling, and silence. The discovery, handling, and identification of the human remains linked to Hitler, Eva Braun, and other members of the Führerbunker inner circle constituted one of the most complex aspects of the Soviet investigation after the fall of Berlin. The presence of incinerated bodies, partial remains, corpses in various states of decomposition, and contradictory testimonies generated a verification process that lasted for several weeks and was marked by political decisions, forensic procedures, and a rigorous management of information. The first Soviet focus was to determine if Hitler was dead, if his body had been recovered by his followers, or if he had escaped. From the Soviet political command, the priority was absolute: to confirm, with physical evidence and irrefutable documentation, the death of the Nazi leader. The initial information came from prisoners captured in the Chancellery area who claimed that Hitler had committed suicide and that his body had been burned in the garden over an improvised pit. Due to the lack of clear records and the confusion of the moment, the Soviets approached these statements with caution. The first location of remains associated with Hitler occurred on the 2nd of May of 1945, when an intelligence group of SMERSH, the Soviet military police specialized in counterintelligence, examined the area near the exit of the bunker toward the garden of the Chancellery. In a ground depression, partially covered by rubble and moved earth, burned bone fragments, charred fabric remains, and metal parts corresponding to buckles and clothing reinforcements were found. The position and the testimony of some prisoners agreed that this was the area where the bodies of Hitler and Eva Braun had been placed for their incineration. The remains found did not have a complete anatomical shape. The incineration had been partial due to the lack of sufficient fuel and the improvised nature of the process. The bunker personnel had used available gasoline to ignite the bodies, but the combustion had not reached uniform or prolonged temperatures. As a result, the Soviets found burned bones, charred fragments of skull, pieces of jaw, and teeth. Remains of a partially melted pistol and metal pieces from the clothing, including burned buttons, were also found. The initial identification of the cranial remains was carried out through direct inspection by Soviet military doctors. One of the fragments included sections of a jaw with teeth that had particular characteristics. Smersh ordered dental records from Hitler's dental staff. They captured Käthe Häusermann, Hitler's dentist's assistant, and dental technician Fritz Echtmann. Both confirmed that the jaw and dental bridge found corresponded to pieces made for Hitler years before. This match allowed for a preliminary identification, although full verification would require further analysis. The remains associated with Eva Braun were found mixed with those of Hitler in the same pit. Among the fragments, remains of fine fabric were observed, possibly from a dress, and metallic elements that corresponded to female closures and reinforcements. However, the identification of Braun was more complex due to the greater degree of destruction of her body. Nevertheless, the proximity between both remains, the statements of witnesses, and the location allowed them to be considered linked as part of the same event. In addition to these remains, the Soviets found other bodies in the garden and inside the bunker. Among them were those of Joseph and Magda Goebbels, who had committed suicide on the surface after killing their children in the Führerbunker. Their bodies were found partially burned near the entrance to the bunker. The remains showed burns on the upper part and damage from explosions, consistent with attempts at destruction using gasoline and grenades. The identification was facilitated by the scarcity of other adults in the area and by the immediate testimonies of prisoners. Inside the Führerbunker, the Soviets found the bodies of the 6 children of the Goebbels family. They were arranged in beds in one of the rooms, partially covered. They showed signs of cyanide poisoning. They were in a relatively stable state of preservation due to the underground conditions, absence of sunlight, low ventilation, and moderately cold temperatures. The Soviets recorded these bodies with particular attention due to their value as evidence of the events that unfolded in the last hours of the regime. Other bodies belonging to officers, escorts, and aides were found in various rooms and corridors of the bunker. Some had died by suicide using a pistol, others by poisoning. The Soviets identified bodies of officers like Hans Krebs and Wilhelm Burgdorf in adjoining rooms. They had self-inflicted gunshot wounds. Their personal documents and uniforms facilitated immediate identification. The handling of human remains inside the bunker required a systematic forensic examination. The Soviets carried out autopsies in improvised facilities near the Chancellery or in temporarily set up external areas. In the case of Hitler, the charred remains were moved to a safe place for analysis. Due to the partial destruction of the bodies, forensic reports focused on dental fragments, cranial bones, and preserved organic tissue remains. The dental analysis was decisive. The presence of complex metal bridges, including components made with gold and ceramic, allowed them to be compared with Hitler's previous dental records. The Soviets showed the fragments to Häusermann, who accurately described the features of the dental bridges crafted by dentist Hugo Blaschke. This comparison was deemed decisive to confirm that the remains belonged to the Nazi leader. The jaw bridge revealed dental repairs that matched procedures performed on Hitler years earlier. The initial information was not disclosed publicly. The Soviets adopted a policy of strict secrecy around the finding. Stalin's political command ordered that any premature dissemination be halted and that the analysis be carried out exclusively under NKVD control. The reason was to avoid international speculation and maintain total control over the narrative about Hitler's fate. The political manipulation of the finding caused delays in the internal disclosure of the forensic results. Although Soviet experts had sufficient evidence to affirm that Hitler had died, Stalin allowed alternative theories to circulate to politically pressure the Western Allies. This caused confusion, both within the Soviet administration and among the populations of the occupied countries. The remains attributed to Hitler and Eva Braun were moved after their preliminary identification. Initially, they were kept in sealed boxes under military custody. Over the years, the remains would be moved several times, including transfers to Magdeburg and their eventual destruction in 1970 by KGB agents following superior orders. In each transfer, the bone fragments, teeth, and any associated metallic components were recorded. The reason for the transfers was to ensure that they did not become symbolic or cult objects. Overall, the process of identifying and handling the bodies in the bunker reflects a technical procedure conditioned by political factors, where the finding, analysis, and custody of the remains of Hitler, Eva Braun, and other members of the Nazi regime were treated with internal rigor, but enveloped in secrecy and external manipulation. From discovery to myth, what the bunker revealed. The discovery of the Führerbunker by Soviet forces generated a considerable volume of information about the last days of the Third Reich, but it also opened up a broad field of uncertainties, documentary gaps, and contradictions that contributed both to historical understanding and the formation of later myths. The combination of material remains, incomplete documents, fragmentary testimonies, and the political handling of information by the victorious powers established a complex basis for reconstructing what happened in the last days of the Nazi regime, and for understanding which aspects remained deliberately hidden or were distorted over time. The existence of the bunker as a physical and administrative space allowed for the precise observation of how the command system of the Third Reich disintegrated during the final months of the war. The hand-updated maps, incomplete documents, unfulfilled orders, improvised notes, and contradictory reports found inside the bunker evidenced the operational collapse of the military and political control structures. The lack of coherence in the documents found reflected the deterioration of the coordination capacity between the armed forces, the Chancellery, and the regional commanders. Each room contained evidence of interrupted actions, unsigned papers, unsent orders, and inconclusive military analyses. Although part of the administrative material found in the bunker offered details about unit movements, communications between commands, and last-minute decisions, most of the content was insufficient to reconstruct a detailed and complete chronology of the collapse in Berlin. This was because many documents had been moved or destroyed before the Soviet entry. Empty boxes and piles of partially burned papers were found, indicating attempts to eliminate information, albeit without systematic planning. The lack of a cohesive archive in the bunker forced researchers to rely on multiple indirect sources. The notations found in the map room showed the progressive contraction of the territory under German control. The change from recent documents to more local maps, focused exclusively on Berlin, reflected the operational isolation in which the Nazi leadership found itself. The incomplete documents revealed that, in the final days, Hitler's decisions were based on partial reports or unverifiable assumptions, which explained the gap between his final orders and the actual situation on the battlefield. This evidence supports the conclusion that the bunker was no longer an effective command center, but a space where a symbolic appearance of authority was maintained. The physical conditions of the bunker also offered evidence of the psychological impact of isolation on its occupants. The small rooms, constant artificial lighting, lack of adequate ventilation, and the remains of food and drinks found in various rooms showed that the space had been used beyond its intended capacity. The logistical deterioration reflected in empty cans, remnants of stale bread, bottles of cheap wine, and dirty utensils indicated that the occupants had stopped following normal routines of order and cleanliness. This material deterioration served as an indirect indicator of the moral and physical wear of the staff who remained in the bunker during the last weeks. The presence of abandoned personal objects allowed a partial reconstruction of daily activities. Family photographs, notebooks, civilian clothing, and cosmetics showed that many occupants tried to maintain a degree of normalcy inside the bunker, although the accumulation of scattered objects indicated an abrupt abandonment. The combination of domestic elements and military objects illustrated the convergence of civilian life and warfare activity in a space originally designed to shelter a small command nucleus. One of the most significant aspects that the bunker revealed was the fragmented nature of the final political decisions of the Nazi regime. The discovery of Hitler's political testament, along with the partial drafts of final orders, showed how an attempt was made to impose administrative continuity even when the structure of the state had almost completely dissolved. The existence of these documents within the bunker indicates that Hitler continued to think in administrative and ceremonial terms until his final hours, which contrasts with the actual military situation. However, a considerable portion of the documents mentioned in testimonies was not found, indicating that they were removed or destroyed before Hitler's suicide. The analysis of the bunker also revealed the difficulty in reconstructing the exact sequence of suicides and deaths that occurred within the complex. Although blood stains, cyanide vials, weapons, and documents associated with several members of the Nazi leadership were found, precise identification of each suicide required a combination of physical evidence with subsequent testimonies. The absence of some complete bodies, the presence of burned remains, and the dispersion of objects complicated the forensic reconstruction. The dental remains found were the key evidence to identify Hitler. However, the Soviet decision to keep the identity of the remains secret for decades contributed to the proliferation of alternative theories. The discovery inside the bunker allowed for confirmation that Hitler had not escaped, but the initial lack of transparency generated doubts in several countries. The Soviet silence about the authenticity of the remains contributed to the creation of the myth that Hitler could have survived, a rumor fueled by the Soviets for political reasons during the immediate years after the war. The Soviet handling of the human remains and documents from the bunker played a fundamental role in the creation of myths. The fact that the Soviets moved Hitler and Eva Braun's remains, hid them in secret facilities, and manipulated the disclosed information allowed for misunderstandings to arise both in the West and in the Soviet Union. Internal Soviet documentation showed that dental analysis had been conclusive, but publicly ambiguity was maintained. The result was a narrative void that left room for persistent speculations. The Soviets collected a significant amount of documents from the bunker, many of which were moved to Moscow and classified. Among them were military orders, administrative documents, and personal notes that helped complete the picture of the final days of the regime. However, the lack of public access to these documents for decades caused Western historians to rely on indirect testimonies or secondary documents, which led to discrepancies in the initial narratives about the end of Hitler and the operation of the bunker. The bunker also revealed the lack of cohesion within the Nazi leadership during its final days. The documents found in different rooms showed contradictions in the orders, with simultaneous instructions that were incompatible with each other. The physical evidence indicated that the commanders attempted to implement strategies that were no longer viable. The fragmented communication records, along with handwritten messages, showed that decisions were made without updated information or based on contradictory reports. The bunker provided direct evidence of chaos in the chain of command. The combination of physical, documentary, and forensic evidence allowed for the creation of a strong image of the end of the Nazi regime, although it left room for myths derived from inevitable gaps and subsequent political decisions. The bunker became a symbol of both the collapse of the Third Reich and the uncertainties generated by incomplete or manipulated information after its fall. What the Allies found inside revealed the total disintegration of a system that had dominated Europe, but also laid the foundations for decades of speculation, historical debates, and construction of narratives that still today shape our understanding of that decisive moment.